Good afternoon and welcome to the Walter and Betsy Stern Conference Center here at Hudson Institute. I'm Ken Weinstein, President and CEO of Hudson Institute, and we are pleased to welcome everyone today for a discussion of a major new book on China by former Hudson Institute Senior Fellow Chris Ford. China Looks at the West, Identity, Global Ambitions, and the Future of Sino-American Relations. This book is a must-read. It's really an extraordinary series of observations on how China understands the West, and it really is must-reading on the eve of the summit between Xi Jinping and President Obama here in Washington later this month, which is occurring, as we all know, against a backdrop of massive economic turmoil in China, unprecedented cyber attacks from China on U.S. government databases, massive reform of the People's Liberation Army, and reports of significant internal struggle within the Communist Party as well. So U.S.-China relations are very much towards the forefront of a very busy international policy agenda. We have an excellent panel for us this afternoon, and we will begin things today with remarks from Congressman Randy Forbes. Congressman Forbes is a longtime friend of Hudson Institute. He represents the 4th District in Virginia in the House of Representatives. He's the founder and co-chair of the U.S. Congressional China Caucus. He is the chair of the House Armed Services Subcommittee on Sea Power and Projection Forces. He is a forceful and insightful voice on U.S.-China relations and on China's growing military prowess. And it's my great pleasure to welcome him momentarily to give our keynote address. After his remarks, we're going to have a panel discussion moderated by Dr. Michael Pillsbury, who directs Hudson's Center for Chinese Strategy and the man who is himself the author of the best-selling book, The 100-Year Marathon, China's Secret Strategy to Replace America as the Global Superpower. The discussion will begin with a few remarks from Chris about his book, and then we'll hear from our other distinguished panelists, Elbridge Colby of the Center for New American Security and Miles Yu of the U.S. Naval Academy. Afterwards, copies of Chris Ford's new book will be available for purchase. Let me thank everyone for coming today, and let me ask everyone to extend a warm welcome to Congressman Randy Forbes.
Well, thank you so much, and I'm going to be brief because I know you want to get to the main acts, and I want to just say, first of all, how much I appreciate the work that the Hudson Institute does. Thank you so much for allowing me to be here today, and you've got a wonderful panel, great moderator, and Bridge Colby and Mike Pillsbury both are people that I go to all the time to get their opinion because I value it so much. And Chris, I just appreciate so much your service throughout the years and what you've done with this work. And I want to begin by saying this: if you think this is just about history or past history, you are just incorrect. If you think this is just a work that is irrelevant for a big part of those individuals living in the United States because it is about a 12-hour time difference away from us, you're incorrect. As we just heard mentioned, we are facing or on the eve of a major summit between two major powers in the world, and probably both leaders of those countries would love to be somewhere else other than their countries because of all of the things that are going on at that time. It behooves us to just make sure, though, that we have the factual basis for which we can use to make good decisions. And I want to just give you an overlay of why I think this book is so important. Years ago, I remember going to China. I led a Codel with then Congressman Ike Skelton. Many of you know Ike became the chairman of the Armed Services Committee. Ike was a dear friend of mine when he was a Democrat. He was a Democrat. When they were in majorities, he would lead the Codels. When the Republicans were in majority, I would lead the Codels because we had that kind of relationship. And oftentimes we'd get in briefings, and Ike would say, when it comes to China, there's no difference between Republicans and Democrats. And he'd sit back and say, I'm going to let Randy ask all the questions. And I remember as we came back from one of the Codels, we looked and we said, I told him when we got on the plane, I said, they're going to build aircraft carriers, you know. And I said, I can tell by the way they're bringing all their stuff together, the kind of metal they're creating and those kind of things. We came back and we talked to the Pentagon. The Pentagon basically said, oh, no, they're not gonna do that. And they even gave us a white paper to prove it. And of course, later we got some satellite imagery that suggested they might be wrong. And the part of that, though, Ike and I decided to do, we really scoured committee meetings and subcommittee meetings on what we knew about China, and we found we didn't know very much about China. They knew so much more about us. And so we decided to create the China Caucus, not because we were going to be pro-China or against China, but because we wanted to be a clearinghouse of ideas, and we hoped that what we could do is either by inspiration or perhaps by jealousy or whatever else we could do, we could create a debate that would go on in Congress. And I still remember the day that we had the kickoff for the caucus, we had a large number of members, more than most caucuses, probably had 20-some members in there. But what really astonished me was the number of television cameras, I think there were about 15 or 16, from China that were in there filming what we were saying. And literally it was interesting because we were supposed to do it at 2 o'clock, and they called votes about 3 minutes to 2. And so we were going down the hallway, and all the cameras were following us because they thought we were just leaving, at that time. But here's what got me. It got me then, and it got me on every single hearing we have. There are cameras in there filming the words that I'm saying, the words that other policymakers are saying. And they're taking them back somewhere for people in China to at least bring those words into the decision-making process. I recognize those of you who've traveled to China. Every single time we have a series of meetings there, and they're back-to-back meetings. This is what happens in every single one. You know the format, how you normally have it, 2 big chairs at the front, everybody all around. You have a meeting for 50 minutes. Normally the Chinese leadership talks, and then they give us 10 minutes to have questions or respond. It's almost like clockwork. But here's the key thing. In each situation, by the time we get to the next meeting, they have simulated everything we said. They have somehow transported it to the next speaker, and they have carefully scripted what that next speaker is going to say. So he's incorporating what we said with the message that they want to have delivered. Here's the last part of that. We know today that many countries, and China is one of them, spend a lot of money and a lot of energy taking their decisions but then repackaging those decisions to words that they want the world to hear. And the reason this book is so important, and today is so important, is Chris has done really a phenomenally complex and yet phenomenally simple thing. What he's done in this book is to simply raise the question, does it not make sense for us, if we want to make good policies, that we wouldn't just listen to the verbiage that's been scripted, but maybe we would go back and read what people are actually talking about in China, that we would read their own words, the unscripted words, so that perhaps through that we can get some idea of what they are really thinking, not just about China, but about the United States and about the rest of the world. And I would suggest that on the eve of this summit, on the eve of all the decisions we have to look at with this very complex bilateral relationship that we have with China, it is imperative that we begin to say, what are they actually saying about themselves? What are the facts we need to bring in to this whole calculus as we develop strategies to deal with a very complex world and a very complex situation down the road? That's what Chris has done in this book. That's the discussion you're going to hear with these panelists today. That's what Mike is going to help walk you through with his ability to moderate this panel. And then the closing thing I would share with you is this, which Chris, I think, was one of the findings that you have, that very much a thread running through all of their thoughts, all their discussions, is the prominence that they view China to be in at some particular point in time, whatever that particular point of time might be. It is important for us in this country to recognize at least that viewpoint, because it may very well give us some clarity as to what their ultimate goals might be, their ultimate decisions, so that we can create strategies that help us make sure that we are navigating through some very, very challenging waters in the years ahead. And the last thing I want to leave with you is this. I see so many people who don't understand the importance of understanding this region. The importance is, as many of you know, that today our friends in New York, as they're sitting up there making financial decisions, about 97% of those financial decisions are going to be by underwater cable. Underwater cable that is going to be protected by the United States Navy in that particular situation. We know that about 85% of our goods are going to be traveling on sea lanes as we move through trade. But the other thing that we know is that in the Asia-Pacific area, about 2/3 of the world's trade over the next 10 years is going to go through that area. It's going to be incredibly important to this country that we have the right strategies as we move into the next several years. So, Chris, thank you so much for this great work, and to all the panelists, thank you for your work on this area. We look forward to your comments. Thank you all for being here today.
Thank you. In a court of law, we would say all rise, and everybody would stand up. I think a subcommittee chairman for sea power is pretty important, but you didn't stand up, so we may have offended a very powerful congressman. My only role today is to call on people to speak and see who wants to ask questions from the audience. I think Chris Ford is being celebrated today for a really magnificent book. There are 2 points about launching a book. One is for the author and the commentators to give reasons to buy the book. The second is not to go too far, not to tell everything in the book so that nobody buys it and thinks
I think we're safe. It's,
I think they have a full picture. There's a Chinese proverb for this, Maochun, I know you know this, 不要和盘托出, don't raise the whole platter, is a rough translation. I myself only want to point out one reason to buy the book, and that is the summit with President Xi and President Obama is only 2 weeks away. And on the last 2 pages of Chris Ford's book, pages 499 and 500, he gives a cautionary note about how not to conduct the summit in 2 weeks. He talks about congeniality, and in a way that we've already seen this begin in the last couple of weeks, comments out of the White House and from the Chinese ambassador here and from Beijing, that this is going to be a delightful surprise, a very warm summit, the essence of the kind of congeniality you talk about on the last 2 pages. But Chris Ford also warns against that. He says congeniality is not a bad thing, but it needs to be coupled with toughness and firmness. And he explains that many people still think, and I'm afraid you mean powerful people in our government, still think toughness and firmness will only upset the Chinese and turn them in an anti-American direction. So on the last page of his book, he gives the reason why that is not the case, that China already thinks that way, so that there's nothing, not quite nothing, but little we could do in terms of being tough and firm that would change their way of, to use the book's title, the way China looks at the West. So with that opening comment, I call upon Chris Ford not to hapan totru, but to give us reasons to buy this book, which I personally think is just magnificent.
Thank you very much, Mike. It's a great pleasure to be here. Good afternoon, everybody, and thanks to all of you for coming. There are a lot of thanks that are in order. To Hudson, of course, for graciously hosting this institute. Thank you very much, Ken. To Mike for moderating. To Congressman Forbes, of course, for offering us his wisdom to this. For my fellow participants up here for offering us their wisdom and being gracious enough to come and to plow through a very painfully long book, I'm sure, in preparation for this. And also, I should add, thanks are due to Mr. Andrew Marshall, lately of the Pentagon's Office of Net Assessment. for his support and encouragement over the years, and for his willingness of his office to fund the research that ultimately resulted in the book that you guys either have in front of you or hopefully will soon have in front of you. So thanks to all of them, and of course the usual caveat, since I am a congressional staffer, nothing I say here will be anything other than my own views, and will, any resemblance between my views and those of anybody else in the U.S. government is a coincidence. Hopefully a felicitous coincidence, but a coincidence nonetheless. So please remember the caveat. This is just me talking. Do not impute it to anyone else, or I will be in serious trouble. There are a lot of issues that I thought about choosing to talk about here today, to draw out from this very long book. But I think for purposes of, especially because in light of what Mike has said of the upcoming summit, one of the things, what I would like to focus on here today to get the discussion started, is to try to draw out some of the policy implications of the extended analysis of Chinese understandings of the United States, of the West, and through those prisms of China itself. And so really what I'm focusing here is on some of the elements in the final chapter, which I'd like to draw out for you, and I think my fellow panelists will also probably have some reactions to those ideas. I would offer, I think, 4 or 5 key lessons. The first one stems from the degree to which I would argue, and do argue at some length, that Chinese narratives of and approaches to the United States seem to have developed and to be driven by Chinese internal dynamics to a very great degree. Chinese thinkers for more than a century, as I recount, have expressed and struggled over their hopes and fears for China, in significant part through their interpretations of the non-Chinese world, and especially the United States, with Chinese political dynamics manifesting themselves on the terrain of, and through contestation for control over, if you will, the Chinese narrative of America. The Chinese Communist Party, CCP regime, has itself always devoted great attention and energy to controlling and shaping this narrative, and how the United States is interpreted to Chinese has varied according to the tactical needs of the party's legitimacy strategy at any particular time. Now, I think U.S. policymakers need to remember this, because it suggests that Beijing's approaches to Sino-American relations are only partly influenced, or even capable of being influenced, by what the United States actually does. It is still something of a mantra in some parts of the China policy community in this country, as I think Mike was alluding to, that we must not think that, or act as if, China is a competitor or any kind of an adversary, because this will simply confirm the sort of worst suspicions of hardliners in the Chinese regime, and thus become a self-fulfilling prophecy. And again, as Mike has previewed for you, I think that's an analytical mistake. The PRC has taken very different approaches over the years for tactical reasons, based upon its assessments of various factors, not least what it stood to gain from smooth Sino-American relations in support of its dream of national return, what the trends of comprehensive national power, CNP, a subject on which Dr. Pillsbury has written extensively, what the needs of the trends of CNP were felt to be, and what the domestic legitimacy discourse of the party state was felt to require. Beijing, however, has perceived the United States as an adversary and a competitor all along through this process. And the darkness and confrontationalism that is inherent in these narratives, I think, is of a sort that cannot simply be dispelled or Chinese strategic approaches redirected simply by, as Mike indicated, U.S. congeniality. So that's the first lesson. So the second lesson has to do with, well, of course, then what can we do to influence Chinese behavior, especially when it seems to be turning toward the worse in recent years? And I would argue that a second important lesson inherent in the analysis that I offer in the book is that U.S. policymakers retain at least one type of tool, or set of tools, if you will, that may still be able to influence how it is that Chinese leaders make choices about and act on the basis of whatever grim and adversarial images they may still cherish nonetheless, and which they have been cultivating in their own political system with some assiduousness for quite a few years. Chinese perceptions of U.S. economic decline and political paralysis may have reduced or removed the positive aspects of what I call emulative aspiration as an ingredient of Chinese foreign policy making. But while this has left Beijing's America policy, I think, less constrained by tactical caution than it used to be, it's also, if anything, heightened the relative importance of risk manipulation and cost imposition. And those things we still have some ability to do. To the extent that debates do continue, and I think that they do, continue within China's political elite over what degree and to what extent and for how long to abandon Deng Xiaoping's famous cautious time-biding policy of non-provocative strategic caution, in favor of much more self-assertion against the United States and other countries, I think to the extent that that debate still goes on, it remains within our power to affect how costly it is that Chinese leaders are likely to perceive such self-assertiveness to be. My book's analysis suggests that perceptions of potential political, military, and economic cost are perhaps the most important single factor that still constrains Sino-centric provocations in East Asia, as well as more broadly on the global stage. In this respect, from a sort of policy recommendation perspective, I would urge that American competitive strategists consider how to in various ways, make Chinese adversarial behavior much more painful, not least by increasing our ability to impose costs on them in ways that the regime in Beijing seems most to fear. This, for example, might suggest a greater role for such things as more robust efforts to undermine the party state's information controls at home, efforts to skew its efforts, and to undermine its efforts to skew the rest of the world's narratives about China in ways favorable to the party state. It might involve more resolute promotion of civil rights, human rights, religious liberty, and democratic political values in China. Economic or resource access pressures, especially in times of concern on that very front at home in China. Perhaps cultivation of institutions by and among and for countries, states that are faithful to democratic values as such, especially those in East Asia. I wrote an article on concert of democracies thinking, and one should perhaps re-explore these kinds of things because it's precisely that kind of thing that the regime in Beijing seems very much to be afraid of. Certainly their propaganda narrative talks about it as a deep, dark threat that we are actually engaged in already, and to the extent that we are being discredited for doing these things to start with and yet aren't doing them, we might as well get some of the advantage of having done so. And of course, better resourced Defense Department policies and postures vis-a-vis China's emerging military capabilities. Finally, I would also suggest that this kind of competitive strategy approach would suggest a much more prominent role for political military diplomacy in the creation and maintenance of stronger cooperative and security relationships with countries, both around China's periphery and farther afield, whose policies, jointly or severally, can raise the perceived costs and risks of assertiveness in Beijing. So, next issue. And this is one which some of my panelists may have particular disagreements. We'll have to see. I think there's an important question as to the degree to which Chinese perceptions of, the impact of Chinese perceptions of American policy towards China, and to what extent it is driven by what international relations scholars might call realist motives or idealist motives. And I think depending upon how analysts in Beijing assess this question, it can have very, very important implications for the future of the relationship. If American foreign policy, for example, with respect to China, were felt to be fundamentally realist in its orientation, then I would imagine that Chinese leaders can be expected to conclude that Washington is irrevocably hostile to China's rise, and that it will be committed to precluding China's return, as it's called, no matter what. This conclusion would fit very well with the current threat narratives being put out by the propaganda offices in Beijing. But on the other hand, if the United States were perceived to be driven to a significant degree by idealist motives, the situation might be rather different. If we, for example, were perceived to, if it were perceived that America's opposition to China's rise or return is not intrinsic or structural, but instead stems largely from Washington's principled opposition to the Chinese political system, this might have very significant implications. It would imply that the United States might be willing to, at least some degree, to accept a risen China if that China were a democracy, faithful to the basic human values that modern liberal democracies prize. Now, if you frame it this way, democratic change at home would then become in the strategic interest of China itself. If China's regime type is the final obstacle to national rejuvenation, as conceived in Beijing, and return to international status and respect, all patriotic Chinese eager to vindicate the Chinese dream of return would perhaps instantly acquire a powerful stake in sending their party leaders packing. Especially because I suspect, and we may have some disagreements over this, many Americans in fact are idealist in just that way. This perhaps could open up some very interesting public diplomacy and perception management opportunities. Okay, very quickly now, the final couple of points. Competitive strategy against what I call a virtuocracy. I spend a lot of time talking about virtuocracy and the idiosyncrasies of that kind of an approach to power in the book. And I think if U.S. policymakers were to understand that they are dealing with a Chinese government that does have profound virtuocratic pretensions, and that is one which grounds much of its asserted legitimacy on claims to sort of meritocratic benevolence and political moral righteousness, however implausible that may seem, this very fact alone might open up certain policy alternatives that we have not been very keen or able or willing thus far to turn to. I think it's a characteristic weakness of an ostensibly virtuocratic autocracy that it has difficulty shrugging off what in other systems might be handled merely as regrettable errors or things that in a democracy, for example, could be corrected at the ballot box. In our system, if things are being run abysmally badly, the easy answer is, well, obviously we elected someone who doesn't have the right recipe, and we should turn them out and replace them with someone who has the correct recipe. In a system which justifies its hold, in which the elite justifies its hold on power upon the idea that only they are sufficiently benevolent, disinterested, omnicompetent, omniscient, and wise and wonderful to be able to monopolize power without check or accountability forever. If your only claim to power is that kind of performance metric that you can do everything so darn well that you deserve to be running things in that fashion, this is a system that does not shrug off problems very well. You can't admit that anything was your fault. You can't admit that you screwed up. You can't admit that you made bad choices or perhaps were a corrupt, nasty thug. And those things are not answerable by a change of personnel because it indicts the very nature of the political system from top to bottom. And I think that kind of a virtuocracy is uniquely vulnerable to certain types of pressures, which we have been very reticent about. But we might do, for example, worse in competing against such a system to obtain and publicize information about the corruption, abuses of power, errors, or other meretricious personal or professional behavior of the ruling elite there. One might set about in various ways, that and others, to systematically poke holes in the Communist Party's legitimacy narrative by making people more aware of the myriad ways in which the regime's practice betrays its pretensions to omnicompetent benevolence and disinterested meritocracy. Just a thought. And I think generally, as a way to look at how we might form a competitive strategy, I would suggest that it might be valuable to use the Communist Party's dark and semi-imaginary threat narratives of American-led subversion and global anti-China bias as something of a Rorschach test. They are themselves, in some respect, telling us what they most fear. And to the extent that that's the case, that may provide us a way to help identify points of pressure and leverage that we haven't hitherto used. I would argue that in this respect that we need to avoid falling into the trap of mirror imaging. It is not, we need to be more sinologically informed as we build our strategy and not fall into the trap of tailoring our approaches to what would influence us in the desired ways were we in their shoes, because, of course, we are not in their shoes, they are. And we need to understand that they in ways better than I think we do right now if we're to have an effective competitive strategy. We need more strategic sinology. And finally, last very quick point, as I suggested earlier, we need to do more to plan our approaches with an eye to how our strategies would work or might work or should work against a landscape of possible alternative Chinas. The scholarly community that observes China is very much divided over the future of what's going on there, what to make of current economic problems, what to make of internal leadership squabbles, how successful will reform efforts in the People's Liberation Army be. There are myriad questions on which there is no known answer, probably in China too, let alone over here when we're trying to observe somewhat opaque systems from the outside. We don't know exactly what will happen, and we need to be building our strategies not just against what we think will work very well against a most likely center of gravity probability outcome of what will happen in China, but against a range of things that might happen. And I would suggest that even a strategy that doesn't work absolutely, this is a very Herman Kahn kind of observation. I say this with great pride, having been at Hudson Institute for several years. A very Herman Kahn kind of insight that you need to build a good plan is one that you shouldn't build it to perform optimally against the most likely outcome if by doing it that way you ensure that it will perform appallingly against alternative possible outcomes which are not foreclosable. We need to build strategies with an eye to how they perform against a landscape of alternatives, and I see very little of that kind of a thinking in U.S.-China strategy today, and I would urge that much more be done about it. That is way too much verbiage to start off with, but I'm delighted for the chance to talk and be here, and I'm looking forward to hearing both from my fellow participants and from all of you here present. Thank you once again for having me.
Wow. And you're willing to stay until 2 o'clock to answer questions and to hear what you think might be criticism from your fellow panelists.
Don't tell the Senate Banking Committee, but I'm willing to stay the rest of the afternoon. So. But you all are not. I understand that too. So.
Our first commentator is the author of 2 classic books himself, published by Yale University Press. he has tenure in the Department of History at Annapolis, teaching the next generation of midshipmen about U.S.-China relations. I've read the 2 books, and today is the Chris Ford Day. We're here to celebrate and launch and promote Chris Ford's book. But perhaps, Chris, I could be forgiven by mentioning Yu Maochun's 2 books in some ways support your argument. He pretends to only be looking at the period from 1942 to 1947 in these 2 books. But he shows the vicious policy debates that go on inside the American government, especially inside the intelligence community at the time, over the nature of China, what the narrative that's being fed to the Americans is. So in a way, I'm hoping his comments will somehow reference his 2 classic books. But Professor Yu has been criticized in our field for many years as being too shy, too soft-spoken, and will not necessarily tell us what he really thinks today.
The insiders are chuckling right now, actually. So,
Professor Yu, do you want to be the first commentator?
Sure. Thanks, Mike. There's also a Chinese proverb says, 枪打出头鸟. The first bird that sticks its head out gets shot first. So, well, before I came here, Annapolis is a very peculiar place because they care a lot about popular image. So before I came here, a public affairs officer who's a commander in the Navy is very worried about what I'm going to say. So I told him the first thing I'm going to do is to make a disclosure. Everything I said is just my view. Does not necessarily represent the U.S. Navy or any defense strategy or any defense planning or plot against China.
We invited you to give the U.S. Navy's point of view today.
Well, you all failed that because I have to care about my skin clearance stuff. Anyway, I thought about another anecdote. I've been there for 21 years, a very long time. I remember about 10 years ago, there was a Marine colonel who taught in my department. He had a very interesting way of judging the value of the book is by height and thickness. He had 2 shelves in his office. One is for teaching core courses, standard course everybody has to take. Another one is called his research interest. So on the core course, he arranged books by height. In other words, the highest book, the tallest book, and the left, and then will be the most valuable. And it looks very much like a Marine, attentive stuff. Another bookshelf is books of his research interest, which is about World War II. So he arranged the book according to thickness. The thickest book is the best. So Chris Ford's book has both. It's pretty tall and it's pretty thick. Okay, so this is a very good standard. I would also say that this book actually, I wrote. If you have the book in front of you in the back, I actually have this blurb over there. I called it a landmark study, and it's not because just its height and its thickness. It's really break some ground. I can think of several things. First thing I want to mention is in the China field, particularly with regard to the nature of what China is, and Mike reference to my former books. And I think we have normally a binary image of China. One is the image of China with great history and great cultural richness and land of panda and Great Wall. And that cultural aspect of that and the historical continuity part of that is particularly attractive. So on the other hand, there's also another side of the image that is China is a communist country. It's a country ruled by a Leninistic party with demand for unanimity of opinions and monopoly of power. So for most Americans, and particularly in the China field, these 2 images never quite sort of get reconciled. So what you end up having is a very skewed view of China because of this kind of ambiguity of these 2 binary sides of China. The most notorious example was the CBS famous landmark documentary called Misunderstanding China, which was broadcast, which was prepared for many years, but was broadcast just days before Richard Nixon went to China in 1972. It was a phenomenally sophisticated piece of documentary. It's about 50, 60 minutes long, but it's talked about the first part of how we misunderstood China because talk about Hollywood's racist ideas, Charlie Chan's, Fu Manchu's, supervillain, hero, and the wise Chinese man always speak in fortune cookie English. So those sort of things, and it was struck core to Americans in the 1970s. Even today, you look at this, you should be ashamed of being part of the American sort of a culture because we treat the Chinese in such a way, in public, at least in entertainment, those sort of things. And then, the whole point of this CBS documentary was to point out that it's time for us to change that. See, President Nixon went to China. This is a good opportunity. So Chinese just become just that, the Chinese. There's no distinction of good Chinese, bad Chinese, communist Chinese, nationalist Chinese, or people who are in the middle. Doesn't matter, just the Chinese. It makes a very particular point of why we have treated China so badly. For example, we misunderstood China in World War II. We thought the Chinese were good guys, allies, fighting against common enemy Japan. And then several years later, in the Korean War, the Chinese fought us. So we're betrayed. It's all because we misunderstood Chinese. So this is basically the mentality that blurred the line of traditional China and contemporary China. The binary images were blurred deliberately to create a political environment and the public opinion, climate of opinion, for Richard Nixon to go to China. That has not changed. You look at the most prominent example of Henry Kissinger's book on China. It's the same thing. The two most phrases used by Henry Kissinger, I actually read the book carefully, calculated, are the Chinese and interlocutor. He likes to use that word a lot. It's because in the mind of Henry Kissinger, it's still 1972. He was the major architect of that political diplomatic stroke. So this is basically one. Now, Chris' book break that tradition, make that line very clear. He talks about traditional China. He talks about the land of the pandas. He talks about the land of Great Wall. He also talks about contemporary China, communist China, and how this continuity and changes occur in front of our eyes, and how the Chinese use history, contemporary China, to manipulate the image of the United States. And that's really, really significant. So intellectually, and it's subterranean, is very subversive in that way. So I really recommend that book. Second point I want to make is, American intellectual environment is pretty poisoned since 1950. Who lost China? And were they communists in the government of the United States under FDR and Truman? So ever since that time, China field is basically divided into two kinds, left winger and right winger, right? Panda huggers and dragon slayers. So you have that kind of very poisoned environment. When you criticize China, you're automatically classified as dragon slayer. When you are into panda, all the other, the Great Wall of China, and then you're automatically a panda hugger. So it's very hard to have an impassioned argument about what reality of China really is. And I think if you read the book, you'll find out Chris' book is one of the very rare books that really looks like China as it is. And it didn't really go through that left wing, right wing. Even on China image per se, I mean, it's the first significant book about China in American public awareness is by the American anarchist Harold Isaacs. He talked about images of Asia, and he talked about China a lot. It was 1920s and 1930s. And then the second most important book that shaping Americans' intellectual understanding of China was by John King Fairbanks. John King Fairbanks wrote a book called The China Perceived. And in that book, he basically said, well, there's the progressive China, which is represented by the communist, and there's reactionary China, which is represented by the nationalist. So the communist, the one because it's progressiveness, right? And I checked on Fairbanks basically received his education somewhere in Wisconsin, and very, very progressive. In the part of American progressive movement, if you understand, early part of the 19th century, early part of the 20th century. And then, of course, Steve Maochun wrote the second most important book, Rebuttal. It's a rebuttal against Fairbanks. He called it simply, Fairbanks' book is called China Perceived. He wrote a book basically called China Misperceived. And to talk about why communist China is not what Fairbanks said about it. It's only influential in some very important circle in the United States. One of the most important person who was influenced by that was Andy Marshall. And you don't hear many people talk about that because it's written by a reactionary. So the China field is very poisoned intellectually. Chris' book transcended that. And he didn't get into this left wing, right wing, and he talked about China as is. And I think, really, I highly recommend that. The last part, the second part is, the third part third point I would make about this book is, this book actually also addresses a important inadequacy in the China field. That's because most China scholars, they really know a lot about China. But very rarely do they quite understand America. They, very much like George Kennan. George Kennan understands the Soviet Union very well. But he really couldn't quite understand the American democracy. That's why I always like he's a miserable person. He's basically overcome by jealousy, by disenchantment, and yet his analysis of the Soviet Union in the 1940s was very brilliant. But the sad thing is, his correct views of the Soviet Union and the communist system in the 1940s was sort of influenced by his disenchantment with America later on in his life. So he was basically changing his views left and right, and so that's American tragedy. That's because people devote their life to look at America. So whenever you mention about Chinese sort of a loudmouth, this is extreme right wings, the hawks, and then they will normally think about, hey, look at Fox News and Donald Trump. We have the same people. So it's not the same. The city of Beijing is not run the same way as the city of Los Angeles is run. It's very different. Most China scholars fail to understand that distinction. And it's a very, very important. Jim Lilly, the former ambassador to China, the career CIA guy on China and Northeast Asia politics, intelligence, in his memoir, China Hands, had a very telling episode in which he said, you know what, because he was the first intelligence officer to China after Nixon went to China. And he said, the most frustrating aspect of my job about collecting information intelligence on China for the US government is that when I prepare reports for months on a very important subject, somebody from Washington, D.C., very important person, senator, vice president, or even president, will come to China, spend 3 days, and then instantly that 3 days will turn this important politician into a China expert. Whatever you say, whatever your intelligence report to him, doesn't matter because he had already formulated his view on China based on his 3 days of experience in China. That is very important. The reason why that is the case is because most American policymakers do not really place China at the top of the priority. Okay? You look at the American Secretary of State in the last 150 years, or 200 years, how many of them could claim Asia experts? President Obama keeps saying, we're the Pacific nation. How many Secretaries of State were actually China experts? The last one I checked was John Fox, right? Fox was the secretary of Benjamin Harrison in the 1890s. He resigned in protest because the U.S. government didn't pay much attention to Asia. He resigned and went on to serve Li Hongzhang as his advisor in the 1890s. Ever since then, you don't have anybody who actually who specializes in China. Everybody is about Soviet Union and Eastern Europe and Europe. So that is really important. This book is very important for one particular reason, because Chris, I use this word in the best of all possible ways.
Oh dear.
He's a quintessential bureaucrat. He's a policy analyst. He understands America. You look at his book, he talks about the American political system. He talks about ideology. He look at it at China as one of the many nations of the world that fit into this sort of the universal system of politics, democracy, human rights, all other things all together. Realism. And so that's very important. He speaks the language of Washington bureaucrats. He speaks the language of the American policy. You don't have that. You have a very rare case when you have policymakers who are also policy advisor who are also scholar. And we have these two prominent examples here, Mike and Chris. So, and his book is not just about how China look at the United States. It's also about policy recommendations for people who are dealing with China lately, who discovered China is far more than just Panda, Great Wall, or DF-21Ds. So it's a much more profound, intellectually, culturally, it's an environment. And so that is basically the 3 points I like to mention in a very disorganized fashion. I have one full disclosure because I was one of the, I hope one of several who recommend this book for publication. So the publisher, I did have, you probably didn't know that.
I didn't actually know that.
Okay.
They successfully concealed it.
Very successfully. I wrote a very long review and full of eloquence, and I don't have that right now because it's not written. But the blurb is part of that, so please read it.
You weren't a reviewer too, Brady, were you? I may have actually stacked everything here.
I'm actually not a China policy expert, unlike what this says. But well, great. Well, I guess I'll dive in. Well, first of all, thank you, Chris and Mike, for inviting me, and thanks to Ken. It's an honor and a pleasure to be here. It's a wonderful cause for a good friend for whom I have tremendous admiration, both as a human being and as an intellect in Chris. So it's a delight to be here. Couple of thoughts just right off the bat. One is that I think you've pretty much blocked off the 1.4 billion person market maybe in the People's Republic, so we may actually all have to buy 2 books to compensate for the book sales.
I know I'm not going again, but depends on what you say.
Okay, yeah. And
you may be in trouble too.
I think I think especially if we look at this as in a sort of a Confucian or kind of Neo-Confucian or sort of Mandarinate perspective, quintessential bureaucrat is actually a great compliment. So it's a testament to your skill and intellect.
So good thing, yeah.
All joking aside, this is, as I think has already been amply said, but bears saying again, it's an excellent book, comprehensive but lucid, lyrical, with Chris's typical elegance, but really surveys this fascinating and really important subject about what China thinks, I think, and I'm guilty of this as much as anybody, but there's a tendency for us to think a lot about blue, but this is a real sense of thinking about the other side, thinking about China, but also thinking about it in a way, I think, Miles, you put it well, that is looking at it from a policy perspective, that is to say, not getting wholly disconnected from what's of relevance from a policy perspective here, but really trying to understanding how China makes decisions, how it perceives what we do and how it sees its place in the world and so forth and so on. And I think how it can be influenced. And I think that's one of the big takeaways from this book, from this project is that China can be influenced. It does respond to outside stimuli and even outside perception, even sometimes things that aren't intended to be stimuli, but maybe things that we do as a matter of course. And I think Congressman Forbes' anecdote was very much to that point, that what people say in the halls of Congress, maybe in front of an audience far smaller than this one, may have resonance in China. And I think that's an important thing for us to bear in mind, because I think it does relate to the part of the discussion which sometimes you get. We have to be careful about offending the Chinese. Another is it's hopeless. We can't really, we may as well not even try. But this, I think, Chris's book, among many other things, kind of lays that to rest. And I think it does, contribute to the very much the sort of policy perspective that firmness, an intelligent firmness, a tailored firmness, a calculated firmness, can have an effect on Chinese behavior and can have a quite positive effect on Chinese behavior from our point of view, which I think is of particular relevance these days when we think about the South and East China Seas and China's broader international or portfolio, and also that a strategy is useful. I mean, Mike has written obviously very prominently on his view of China's kind of long-term strategy. My feeling is that it would be lovely for us to have a strategy worthy of an Andy Marshall, but maybe just having some strategy at all, just a kind of a strategic approach at all would be useful. And I think that's hard in our system. I think President Clinton is reported to have said that strategy is overrated and you can get by with ad hoc. And I've heard people coming out of the government say, well, ad hocery is better because it's incremental and it's organic. But I think that if you take Mike's book and Chris's book as well, coming at it from a different angle and different style, that having a kind of a conception of where we want to take things, where we want to go, how we use positive pressure or sort of pressure and firmness as well as positive inducements and incentives is really valuable. So, I mean, there's an immense number of things to talk about, and on the whole, I think I'm pretty much in harmony, if I can use that word, with the thrust of
podium.
Yes, a harmonious podium with Chris's book and perspective, analytical perspective. I think maybe it's of greatest interest if we kind of dive into some of the policy implications, and I'll take Chris's bait a little bit on the realism versus idealism spectrum, and as somebody who kind of certainly wouldn't affiliate with a lot of the academic realists, but from a kind of colloquial perspective, I think of myself as a realist. And I think that this gets at one of the biggest long-term questions about China policy, which is how do we look at the competition with China? I think we're all agreed that there is a competition with China, or that we should be participating in this competition a lot better. But what does it look like over the long term? And I think Chris's contention in the book, and it's shared by people like Aaron Friedberg, with whom I was debating this point recently, is that if you get democratization over time, and particularly a kind of a liberal democratization, I think, although I'll return to that point in a second, that in a sense, and Chris can correct me, but that in a sense the fundamental problems or the fundamental tensions in the relations between the United States and China will essentially resolve themselves. And I think that there's both a sort of a conception that kind of a liberal democratization is not only plausible, but something that we could from a Herman Kahn perspective, that we could reasonably bet on. But also that even if we got to that point, of something like it, that we would pretty much be like we treat Taiwan, I think it was an example, or maybe Japan or something. So in a sense, are we in an enduring competition under almost kind of most plausible futures, or is that competition, to use Chris's term, essentially contingent? My own view, I think, is a bit different from Chris. I mean, I very much, I think that if we had democratization, particularly a kind of a liberal democratization, we would be likely to see a significant amelioration in tensions. But I guess I'm enough of a realist to think that a lot of those tensions would still remain. I mean, I think a country can certainly be democratic. In fact, the transition period to such a democracy might be, in a sense, the most dangerous period, as the academic literature and I think common sense and historical reflections suggest that transitioning democracies like Imperial Germany or Imperial Japan are often the most bellicose and the most assertive. For a variety of reasons we can get into. But I think even a plausibly democratic China is still likely to have interests vis-a-vis our own that are likely to put us in some degree of tension. I mean, one of the if we have problems with China now, I mean, one of the points that people make these days is well, do we really have tensions with China? Do we really have issues that we are worthy of a serious competition? I think the answer is yes. Who will set the rules of the road in Asia in terms of trade, in terms of access? and so forth and so on. But if you take trade, for instance, a plausibly democratic China could also be one that could seek to set terms of trade that are unfavorable to the United States. I mean, look at Japan. Obviously, things are changing now with TPP. A lot of countries that are democratic are, not exactly in sync with us. Again, I think those would be very likely to ameliorate, and the ways that you could work them out, there would be more mechanisms to adjudicate them. But I think the tensions would exist. I think nationalism and every man's patriotism is another man's nationalism. But I think nationalism would still be a potent factor, and in fact, in some respects, there might be an even more assertive nationalism, particularly if it were a multi-party system involving a single party that might be particularly sort of the hawk party in China. So we might see periods of rapprochement interspersed with periods of tensions. Again, in a situation that's likely to be better on the whole. So, even if we got there, I think there would still be problems. And I think the other thing is that strikes me, and especially, reading Chris's work, is, how likely are we to get to a fully liberal democratic China in this sense? In some sense, you could have a liberal democratic China that was not in tension with the United States, but in some sense, that's a little bit tautological, right? But if I look at Chris's work, I see a lot of the themes of the Middle Kingdom, of the Great Telos of Return to Chinese greatness. I see those as being, the Chinese Communist Party may be manipulating them and maybe exaggerating them, but they're very real in the Chinese historical tradition, and they're very deep well springs of that put China in a, if not an adversarial, then at least a situation or relationship of tension with the United States. So, what does this mean practically? I mean, at some level, this is an intellectual argument about the democratic peace theory and the end of history and so forth, which I'm happy to have, but probably aren't. Most people would put them to sleep. But I think from a kind of a policy perspective, there are a couple things to take away. One is that I don't think in the near to medium term this debate is necessarily all that significant. I used to work for Larry Silberman, a great American public servant, and he would always remind me that a lot of the ideological initiatives of the Cold War also had strategic logic, right? And I think that's the case here. So a lot of the things that Chris is talking about that could be justified under so-called idealist grounds also have realist rationales, things to make the Communist Party more uncomfortable, to force it to incur risk and costs if it's more pushy in the international arena in ways that we don't like. There are also things that we might just do because we believe in them: religious liberty, the dignified treatment of human beings, and so forth. That whether or not they have a strategic logic, realist or idealist. So I think that actually this debate it's not a fierce one, but I think it probably has something to do with how we look at timescales. I was just traveling in Asia, and one of the things that often came up was differences about how people say, do we have to deal with the next 10 years? Is that the most dangerous period? Or are we looking at a linear kind of situation with China? I mean, there's people like David Shambaugh have been suggesting that China's about to go over a cliff, so there's sort of an economic rationale for that argument. But if you think that liberalization is likely just around the corner, or China could be put in that perspective, then you may see a more assertive play in the near term as making more sense. My view is the competition is likely to be enduring, so it's better to sort of gird our loins for the long haul and be firm, but not think that we can go put on the afterburner now and expect things to get dramatically better. I mean, in a sense, something like a 1991 is possible in China, but we might get 1991, but we might also get Putin, and a China that has a Putin is likely it's actually going to be less of a transition than the USSR to Putin. I mean, who knows what the future holds? But I think that we should be kind of more the slow and steady, a lot faster and firmer than we've been doing in the last few years for sure, but maybe more of a moderate kind of pace that's designed to last us quite a long time, and puts us in a relationship where even a democratic China that doesn't see things exactly the way that we do is one that we can have apply similar policy tools towards. So with that, I heartily recommend you buy the book and look forward to discussing.
Thank you, Bridge. I have a suggestion. We on the panel could ask Chris one or two questions and then encourage the audience to ask as many questions as they like. And while you're thinking of your questions for Chris, I have one meant to be positive and accentuate why people should buy the book. Many times, books are important because of the evidence and the sources they have. So that even you may not agree with the conclusions at the end. You may be an unreconstructed panda hugger or or the other poisonous camp that Professor Yu mentioned. But it seems to me we should ask Chris about the sources that are new in his book, and I will lead the witness. You obviously, from your footnotes, visited China several times, and you have many references to interviews. The Academy of Governance, for example. A number of Chinese think tank scholars provided information which you did not think was unimportant or unreliable. You used it in your book. You also cite an awful lot of other China scholars' works over the years that you're in some sense using their material to reintegrate and argue a new case. But could you give us some examples, again, in terms of buying the book? What are the rich new things that are tucked away in your 100 pages of footnotes? I gave you a clue as to what I think was very important, the interviews you did in Beijing.
Well, in telling the story or trying to tell the story and understand China through the prism of how the story is told in China, of how they look at us, I viewed it as one of the most important parts of my research to focus on those who are viewed as the professional America watchers, if you will, those who are viewed as definitive and authoritative interpreters of the outside world to Chinese, the people who, in academic institutions, government think tanks, and of course they don't just answer interview calls from random Westerners walking through Beijing. They also write extensively in the Chinese press. They are quoted and relied upon, not necessarily by leaders in the leadership compound in Zhongnanhai. Precisely what feeds into those decision-making algorithms is the subject, I hope, of a great deal of speculation at high levels in the U.S. intelligence community and elsewhere. It's very hard to penetrate that particular question from the outside. But in terms of how it is that the Chinese regime explains the outside world to other Chinese and to other members of, in the sort of general leadership cadre of the very enormous party structure of organization, these are often people who are the sort of the go-to people. I mean, there's a usual suspects list who are always coming up in terms of Chinese press coverage. And I tried to talk to as many of them as I could in person, and spent a lot of time with translations of their work coming out of the Chinese press as well. So what I've tried to do is provide a very deep and broad look at how it is that the official interpreters of the United States to China have interpreted those very questions over time, and more interestingly still in some ways how it has changed, and what the relationship has been between those changes and how it is that Chinese politics and the struggles that have been going on in China itself at the time have been. That, I think, is probably the value. I don't claim to have uncovered some secret treasure trove of documents that no one else has touched. I draw heavily upon other scholars' work. There are some people like Anne-Marie Brady, for example, I think in New Zealand, if I recall, where she's based, who has some extraordinary sources. I don't know who gives her stuff, but she should be careful when she travels in China, I should think.
She reads Chinese.
She reads Chinese.
Brady.
And she has fantastic sources with regard to internal propaganda directives. It's almost as if a half a dozen people in various bureaucratic offices around China sort of immediately forward her all the emails they get from central propaganda people with the latest directive on how to treat this issue or how to treat that issue. The China Media Project in Hong Kong takes very good advantage of the relative freedom of academic inquiry, very considerable actually in Hong Kong, that still exists. Bandersky's people, absolutely. They have a wonderful website. I haven't checked it for a little while since I've been occupied with my more recent jobs, but a major source for material in this book was the translations that they put up routinely of stuff that they themselves also apparently get from sources inside the rest of China. Very, very useful and interesting stuff. So I would identify those kinds of things. And it's not so much that these are not available. I haven't discovered things that no one else has ever had access to by any means. I don't speak Chinese or read Chinese. I am sort of an assiduous collector and synthesizer more than I am an original, like, oh my God, document finder. But I think putting those pieces together, and at least I think it is done in ways in this book that at least that I've not seen elsewhere, outside, well, really anywhere.
Couldn't we
I
also
hope it's
say
useful.
that your materials are fresh? It's the last 2 or 3 years.
Oh,
I noticed the most recent footnotes are at least the end of 2014.
yes.
So you're reflecting current Chinese views based on your interviews, and I noticed a lot of the materials are 2012, 2013, 2014.
That's correct.
So you cannot be criticized for, oh, China might have been that way 10 years ago, but now they're more enlightened about America.
Most of the sources that I'm referring to in this respect come from the last handful of years that sort of are contemporaneous with and that post-date what I refer to in the book as the inflection point of sort of circa 2008, which is when I argue at least that the longstanding Chinese calculation of strategic caution vis-a-vis the United States began to tip in favor of the more confrontational forces within the elite and against the more traditional Deng Xiaoping style biders of time and hiders of capabilities. In my view, the U.S. financial crisis, perceptions of our economic trouble and decline, the years of economic stagnation that have followed the coming of a new U.S. administration committed to walking back U.S. military engagement in the world, years of, I'm sorry to say as a congressional staffer, political dysfunction in Washington, no question about that too, resource problems, spending challenges for the Defense Department and many aspects of U.S. engagement overseas, budget challenges, shutdowns. These sorts of things, in my argument, have helped tip a traditional tension. For many years, there's been a tension between those who sort of were more inclined to follow Deng's strategic cautious, we're not quite ready for sort of a period of confrontation yet, let's kind of hang out and be non-provocative until we're ready, versus those who are impatient. And a strategy of time biding demands patience. I mean, the essence of time biding, this is not a peaceful strategy. We should emphasize that. I think it conduced to peaceful relations for a long time. But the essence of the sort of bide your time and hide your capabilities idea is it's predicated upon the idea that you are getting ready for some period of somewhat greater confrontation of some sort at some point in the future. So it's not a peaceful thing, but in the short term it conduces to pretty placid relations because you assume that you need time to build up your capabilities and therefore a congenial, smooth international relationship where you can learn modernity from those who practice it with the most effect in the outside world so that you will someday be ready for something different, whatever that something different may be. So that strategy demands patience. It sort of invokes aspirations of return to glory while asking people to whom you're talking to keep putting off actually realizing those dreams. And as it turned out, over time, as China's power grew, that patience ended up being in relative short supply. And over time, I think, as I try to tell the story in the book, you see more and more tension between, apparent tension between the sort of traditional, strategically cautious Dengist time biders on the one hand, and what Liu Xiaobo called the boxers, more sort of confrontational attitudes. And the patience wore thin, and I think the inflection point all of a sudden changed the dynamic of the risk calculation. It was important not to allow the negative narratives to utterly overwhelm strategic caution as long as the United States was strong and willful in the international arena and seems to have things that China needed to learn and needed cooperative relations through which to learn. And the inflection point in our problems the last few years, I think, helped tip the balance against that. We no longer so obviously have things, as it's viewed in Beijing, to teach them. Therefore, they no longer need quite the same kind of smooth international relationship to acquire the strength they need. We are less able to challenge them, and it's, on the whole, comparatively costless. And that's sort of what the confrontational sort of, boxers, as Liu Xiaobo called it, that's what the boxers needed in the internal debates. And I think it's not a coincidence that you see things swinging much more in favor, or in the direction of sort of semi-belligerent self-assertiveness in the years since then. So back to the sources are mostly about
So we can
that
say hot,
period,
fresh, new material.
Yes, sir.
Right? And I noticed you don't have a publisher's, this is not a commercial publisher. So he did not give you a big banner and some prose on the back that says this is fresh and hot and new and will change your views of how China looks at the
I
West.
don't recall those discussions. It doesn't slice bread. It will not cure aging. But I hope it's a good, interesting read. If I could,
Miles, are you going to have a question?
I'm sorry, can I just say
Show
one quick
off
thing?
Chris's book?
One quick thing about Bridges' comments, and I don't think I disagree with him
You
as
feel
much.
you should get to reply to the commentators'
I hope that's all
comments,
right.
even though
That was
they-
my question anyway. So
Even though
that's my question.
they largely praised you in the book. So,
Well, I was actually going to praise Bridges' insightful critique, and to say that I don't think I actually disagree as much as one might think. I don't know the answer to how idealist American conceptions are of China or what the implications of that might be. I raise the question because I think it's very important. And I don't think it's a binary one either. It's not that we are entirely realist or entirely idealist. The answer is obviously somewhere in the middle. And the operational question, both from a U.S. strategic perspective and from a Chinese perspective, will be to what degree is that the case? I mean, I think it's clearly true that at some, whenever that might happen, a liberal democratic China would considerably lessen the tensions. To that extent, I think we are idealists. But how much? And would they go away? I don't know, and they would not, of course, completely go away. And the question is where along that continuum we fall. And that's, I think it's an open question rather than one on which I would dare to venture an opinion. And I liked your point about timing as well. And one of the things that I would, in the spirit of planning against a landscape of different alternative futures, I would urge that we not repeat the mistake of the last several decades, and particularly of the 1990s, in 80s as well to some extent, in hardwiring our strategy around assumptions that the forces of history are on our side. I think one of the major problems in the U.S.-China policy community has been sort of a self-flattering assumption that democratic peace theory will inevitably prevail as a kind of inevitable hydraulic force of history. And we don't have to worry about actually having a strategy, because if we simply sit back, the inevitable dynamics of development will equally inevitably conduce to liberal democratic politics. If you believe that history is on your side in that kind of an immediate fashion, I think that is and has been used in the United States, whether intentionally or otherwise, I don't know, as an excuse to have no strategy at all. I think we are deeply remiss as strategic planners if we do not plan against alternative Chinas, including alternative Chinas, which don't go at all as we anticipate them going. And if we are not building strategies on that basis, we are making, I think, a very dangerous mistake. So that's my 2 cents. But thank you for both of you for your comments and insights.
Nina?
I only have one complimentary, basically compliment to what he just said, Chris just said, about why, the question he raised is very important, that is why China turned suddenly aggressive, less cautious as Deng Xiaoping's time would witness. One of the reasons why I think it has something to do with our overall policies in Asia Pacific. If you look at the timing and what China was saying, I know part of this book also reflected that, is our policy in Asia Pacific, particularly with regard to the conflicts that China was involved. That is, our ultimate objective is peace and stability. We said it many, many times. Now, if you're an aggressive person, if you know the only person who can make a person of consequence, who can stop all this fighting, his goal is just do not fight. Ultimately, it's peace and stability. And you're going to push the envelope. You're going to push the envelope knowing that the Americans' ultimate policy is to stop fighting. No matter who is at fault, we don't care about that. So that's why one of the reasons why China see that weakness of that policy, and they keep pushing the envelope. In the end, they know the U.S. we're not going to resort to fight anyway, because we're basically an extremely casualty-averse nation. I mean, I teach at a military institution. I mean, I know that it's been so corrosive in our warrior mentality. Our definitive answer to what constitutes a victory is the Kosovo War, where we didn't lose one single soldier. That's why we strive to. If we have 10 people killed in Afghanistan today, it will become national news. We'll change policy. That's bizarre. Observe. I'm a historian, military historian by training, so I know that this is very dangerous for us. China sees that, so they keep pushing the envelope, and and also another thing is, notice what China was toughest about. And who are the most nastiest with? They're Japan and the Philippines. Why? Because those are two countries happen to be America's only country of mutual defense allies there. So their ultimate goal is to kick the U.S. out of Western Pacific by breaking the military alliance. So Vietnam, yes, Vietnam fought really, but Vietnam can always negotiate. China has never been totally tough with the Vietnamese.
So I don't detect any question for Chris Ford.
Well, my question, I'm just, I say as a compliment what he said. Add that.
Okay, it's getting time for audience questions. Are you ready? I have one observation to make about this panel. Of the four of us, I am the panda hugger. I do not agree with the conclusion that that congeniality doesn't pay off. There's actually a good case, and I hope it will happen at the summit in 2 weeks, to expand the military exchange program with China. It's already grown, it's tripled or more in the last couple of years. A huge amount of misunderstanding on the part of the Chinese military can be reduced by increased exchange programs. I'm also in favor of a number of other panda hugger positions. So I don't want you to go away thinking all four of us were in harmony about, there's no hope with the way China looks at America now. I think, as Congressman Forbes said, there's an obsession, and this is in your book too, Chris, there's an obsession in China with the Americans and what they're doing. So it is possible, I think, for us to make our relationship with China much, much worse, and to provoke them into much higher levels of defense spending, to acquire weapons that are far more dangerous for us than they have now, if we are too tough and too firm with the Chinese. If we go to the point of offending them and what they call their dignity being harmed in this summit, we will pay a serious cost for it. So Chris may say, oh, I agree with you, but I don't think he really does. I think he's much more concerned in this book about the need for us to pay less attention to the Chinese narrative in a way that we can not hurt their feelings. So I'm giving my dissent here, which I hope will increase the sales of your book, because people will say, well, we want to read more of a red-blooded American book, not a panda hugger point of view. Okay, first question.
I would
Back
worry
in the
that,
back.
that hurting Chinese feelings is a little bit like work in the modern office space. It will hurt feelings will expand to fill the space available to them. And so we should be very cautious about how much space we allow hurt feelings to influence
So
our
people should
behavior.
buy this book, right? To understand.
let's hear the
Okay,
audience.
back in the back, you have your microphone already in hand. Good. We need microphones when you ask a question so we can record you.
Yeah, I'm with VOA Mandarin. I have
You're
a
what?
I'm with Voice of America. I would like to ask panelists up there on the fundamental question whether the United States knows how to apply that firmness using a couple of examples. One is the South China Sea. On one hand, we saw the United States invited the press to board the reconnaissance airplane to see how we operating over there. On the other hand, the Pentagon refused to tell us whether the United States has sailed or will sail within 12 miles of these artificially built islands, even though the United States does not recognize the sovereignty of
The
those
Voice of
islands.
America has a question for you, Chris, about the nature of the toughness and firmness you have in mind.
So
would
if
it
I-
include going into Chinese claimed territorial waters in the South China Sea? That's how I would interpret your question for those who can't hear you.
Right, but on the other hand, we see in the Bering Sea that the United States has allowed the Chinese ships to enter the U.S. territorial waters without deeming as other than innocent, so deemed as innocent passage. So I am troubled by this, how this, policy applied here. So I wonder if the panelists can tell us whether we are confused about, how firm we want to apply this. Perhaps, we just don't know. Maybe we are. Maybe they are confused as I am.
Would you
Thank
rather
you.
have several questions in a row, or just do one at a time? Because they're going to be directed at you.
We can probably collect them, but let me just, for the sake of argument, while I'm thinking of it, let me just try to respond to you there. Great question. Do we know how to apply firmness? I mean, I myself wouldn't presume to say that I know all the answers in terms of policy recipes. I have some suggestions that I think I would argue people should think about, and it'd be part of our calculations. But my most sort of emphatic call would be not, everyone should do exactly what I say should be done, but more that to be myself drawing attention to the need to be thinking in those ways, for there to be a much more explicit and deep and thoughtful dialogue about how to develop policy approaches that in fact do meet the needs of a true competitive strategy. I don't necessarily have all those answers, and I don't think any single person does. What I would love to do, however, is to help catalyze much more of a debate in our strategic policy community about how to do that and get that, help encourage that being underway. There may be, at the end of the day, the right answer may be something that I can't foresee now, or maybe disagree with right now if you were to ask me. I don't know. But I think the biggest answer is that we need to be bloody well thinking about how to do these things much better than we have been. Your question about sort of freedom of navigation issues, I think one of the things that distinguishes constructive firmness from provocative firmness, to sort of take Mike's point about not wanting to do too much either. I'm certainly not advocating an absolutely hell for leather confrontational approach on our side either. I think we need, one of the keys to making firmness useful is, one of them, probably many of them, but is consistency. We have been emphatic that about our freedom of navigation missions over very many years in places as far-flung as the former Soviet Union to the Gulf of Sidra to wherever else. We have asserted this position again now in the South China Sea, and to our credit, that's quite a proper position to take. We are less consistent, it would appear from the outside at least, in how we live out that policy declaration. It's not clear that we are, in fact, living up to our promises of keeping the freedom of navigation thing going within our understanding and the rest of the world's understanding of international legal norms in the South China Sea, while we seem to be fairly relaxed about insisting even upon 12-mile sovereignty up in the North Pacific. So I think the inconsistency could be terribly damaging, especially if it results in the conclusion on the part of potential adversaries that, well, we're not really all that serious about this after all. It's just a rhetorical talking point rather than a real policy. And oh, by the way, their commitment to these international norms and values and things that we should be, if they're not compliant with them, we should be shaming the Chinese regime for having failed to observe. Consistency is a virtue, and I fear that we are in danger of squandering that opportunity.
I'd like to answer the question since it deals with somewhat with the Navy. There are two issues here. One is this whole issue of you talk about consistency. I'm talking about the clarity. One of the biggest problems we've had is that encouraged aggression worldwide is the so-called strategic ambiguity. We won't tell you what U.S. would do if you do A, B, and C. Well, it has basically a reflection of two reality. One is that U.S. is the only country of consequence. That's why our U.S. Navy is very strong and the strongest Navy in the world, and we are the country that can basically decide what will or will not happen in places like South China Sea. Knowing that if our policy is not very clear, on one hand, you got the Assistant Secretary of State, Daniel Russell, went to the Congress and said, we do not recognize the legitimacy of China's 9-dash line. So we do not recognize the legitimacy, legal basis of China's claim in the South China Sea. On the other hand, you don't follow through. So what does that mean? The 12-mile sovereign water, China say we create the artificial island there. 12 miles around that, it's ours. If you say we don't recognize your claim in the South China Sea, that means U.S. warship could go through there because we don't recognize yours. We don't do that. And that's basically ambiguity. And that's really, really is unfortunate. Another point is historical precedent. In 1931, when Japan invaded Chinese Manchuria, and the League of Nations was pretty weak, the U.S. policy was what? Non-recognition. We don't recognize Japanese invasion of Manchuria. That basically, didn't say much because the U.S. was deeply isolationist. We're not going to go to war with Japan, even though the policymakers in Washington knew it was very, very dangerous if this trend continued. Sure enough, inaction of Washington and the rest of the world basically encouraged Japanese aggression. What you have here is basically, Pearl Harbor and U.S. getting into the war. So basically, it's very important for people in Washington to read books like this and to know the long-term consequences of inaction and ambiguity. So that's basically my point to your. And the Chinese know this. I don't think that sailing within the U.S. Sovereign water within 12 miles of coastline of Alaska was accidental. It was basically well-timed and to send a very strong message.
Yeah, I'd just say, I think Chris's point is right about, the need to balance, and I don't agree with Mike's characterization, but I think there is, we need to balance, and we do have an interest in stability, a favorable stability, but of course instability. The South China Sea is a really tough problem, and I don't envy the decision makers who are tasked with figuring out how to respond to China's very clever and astute and sort of adaptive strategy. But it does seem to me if we don't recognize the claims, then why aren't we sailing within 12 nautical miles and daring them to do it? Because, both of us know that right now, and for the near term at least, and presumably the medium term, we hope, the U.S. has the military advantage, and so China is presumably not going to walk down that path. So the question is one of resolve. And people in the region are watching, and I think at this moment, it's actually a quite important moment. This gets into the time issue, Chris, is countries in the region in Southeast Asia and beyond throughout the Indo-Asia Pacific are ascertaining whether it is prudent to affiliate with the United States and at least in some terms or in some portions of their policy balance China. And that is and it's only responsible and reasonable to work to balance China if the United States is going to stick around, because the rest of the countries of the region don't have sufficient power and won't have sufficient power to balance China in the future without it, basically, to be simplified. So it's very important for the U.S. to show resolve now, and the South China Sea is becoming one of those, I don't want to use the word tests, but it's becoming a kind of a forum where people are judging, and I think that right now we're not meeting the standard, and there are clearly voices in the U.S. government that are pushing for it, and I think from what I can tell, they're right.
I also like to disagree with the eminent Dr. Pillsbury a little bit, slightly.
It's good to have a debate. See, it's better to have a panel
well,
that has a debate.
Here's the thing. It's not about whether you want to be nice or congenial or not to foreign guests. And that's not the question. So I don't consider myself as a dragon slayer or panda hugger.
But
sometimes,
yes or no? Yes or no? U.S. Navy ships should go inside the 12-mile zone of these claimed Chinese features. Bridge says yes. I happen to say yes myself.
I say yes. You have to go there because
Chris
U.S. government has already made it.
Chris said no. He said maybe. He wants to balance consistent
because we don't.
policy.
You can't.
He was.
You
Look,
can't build.
You have not been to interagency meetings in the White House. I have.
Yeah.
You put your hand up. The president says, okay, Bridge, yes, go. Miles, no, you're against it. Or maybe you're a yes. Chris is a maybe. Now it's a split vote. This is a very important point for the last page of your book.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I think we have
four yeses. On behalf of the Navy, you're willing to say yes, Miles?
Well, can I just finish my thought?
No, you're not talking to the Voice of America question.
I'm answering the question.
The duty is to get you to answer the question.
Okay,
yes or no, Navy ships through the 12-mile
If
waters.
we don't recognize that as Chinese territory, U.S. Navy ships, yes, it's international water. There's no question in my mind that we should go there.
How about while President Xi is in Washington?
Well, that's basically, remember what Congressman Randy Forbes said at the beginning, which I think is very, very insightful. Chinese making policy, to a large degree, depends on how U.S. policy is made. They want to see how our policy is formulated so they can adjust to that. And it's like a shadow boxing, Chinese style.
So you're a yes in the next 2 weeks then, before President
Well, I think
Xi
that's
comes?
a different question.
It's not, Mike, it's not, I'm not arguing with you. I'm not arguing with you.
One
I'm not
of his
saying.
points at the end of the book is congeniality. Okay? The president of China is
but I think, Mike,
congeniality is not for the sake of congeniality. When issue of principle, American prestige, international law is at stake. You cannot be congenial about that. You can be congenial to the Chinese president. He's an honored guest there. You can definitely talk about national pride, be respectful, but you can respectfully disagree.
Xi goes home. Okay,
No, I think that's.
I would love to take a break
to
from the
Beijing.
Hannity show and have another question. How about that?
USTR question. Charles Horner, was your hand up?
Microphone's coming up here in front, I think.
I have to ask a question like we do in USTR, we just yell.
There we go.
Anyway, I thank you. I've been listening to this and I'm quite amazed. Because we have succeeded in trade policy. It was mentioned very quickly in trade. For whatever reason, China agreed to abide by international norms when it joined the World Trade Organization. Until that time, the U.S. could not actively, effectively retaliate against China, but we had too much domestic interest, too much trade flowed in either direction, so every time we did anything. But China joined the World Trade Organization. We have been very firm. We bring more cases against China. Their hands are tied. We have been very firm on currency. There's been a little movement recently, but they have followed through on this thing. So the only question I would ask, and I know military defense people don't visit USTR too often and so on, but I would just simply say there is a Court of Justice discussing this whole question of 9, 12-mile limits and so on, et cetera. I don't know where that's going. I don't know where the U.S. position is. But my assumption, just reading in on the subject, is let that make a ruling, that group, and then we'll make sure it's enforced, because you don't have the enforcement in WTO. But this idea of sending your, I don't want to say, it was ridiculous to say, I'm going to send my ships while the president of China is there. If you want to have a war with somebody, you send the ships in the next 2 weeks, and my grandchildren will go to Canada. But the only thing I would appreciate is that's not at all a serious reaction. Thank you.
Well, certainly for my part, I'm very much looking forward to see what happens with the Philippine case in the South China Sea. It is, in legal terms, a pretty narrowly circumscribed case. It will certainly, I mean, even if it were clear in its judgment and it were emphatically enforced by the entirety of the international community, it would, technically speaking, solve only the smallest portion of the overall disputes there. But it's certainly, I think it was a great idea for them to move forward. I think that is another example of ways in which, and in this case, a very sort of formally appropriate and congenial, if you will, way to press back against Chinese expansion. The idea that they are out of sync with international norms, that it is shameful and discreditable to be behaving in a certain way, is an idea that is not without some traction. One of the points that I emphasized both in my first book, which I do notice is also for sale back there, called The Mind of Empire, which is a sort of a long meditation on Chinese conceptions of global order. But a theme I also pick up in this book, which is in many ways a follow-on to the first one, is to make the point that Chinese conceptions of global order and their view in their role in the world are not, this is not North Korea, in which they just don't give a darn what people think of them. They care deeply what people think of them. And it's actually inherent, I think, in their conception of political authority, that political authority is sort of co-joined with and actually grows out of moral authority. And they don't have a lot of moral authority, but they need to say that they do, and it needs to appear in their own discourse that they do. And so things like the international community bringing them to court for violations of well-understood international legal standards can be very powerful. It's not a cure-all, and there is it's not going to substitute for a robust forward defense posture where that is needed by any means, but it's a part of the mix, and I think we should not forget that those kinds of remedies are indeed important.
I'm glad you raised that question, and I don't consider me as a warmonger. And here's the reason why. I've been observing Chinese Navy for many years. Not at one moment did I believe the Chinese Navy wants to fight a war with the United States. They know it. We know it. And 2 months ago, I was with the Chinese delegation to the Chinese Navy, and they allowed us to go to their DDG, their destroyers, and I see their destroyer is not our destroyer. There's no match there. So the question really is, as I say, U.S. is the only country of consequence. If you don't act, I know the global policeman is a bad term, but in this case, if there's no policeman, you could turn out like in a part of New York City, or Baltimore. It's a very dangerous place to be. So there is the collective will in that general area to want the U.S. to be there to act like policemen. So if policemen don't act, chaos will ensue. The aggressor, the criminal, will commit the bad crimes. So this is the case. I think they really want to see what the U.S. Navy is going to do. And if we don't seize the opportunity to act according to international law, not for the sake of confronting China per se, I don't think they really want to fight a war with the U.S., considering the Americans' preponderance in military strength in that area. So it is ultimately boils down to our will. Now, there's another very important thing. If we don't act decisively, not just irresponsibly, but according to law, international law, regional allies will lose confidence in ours. Japan, Philippines, everybody will go start doing their own thing. It's far more dangerous if the regional allies get into a arms race with China, because they can act without immunity, knowing Americans will not do it. And South Korea is also another case. So there's a far more strategic implication than just like not confronting China in terms of inaction. Inaction, not just the irresponsible action. It just has a lot of a very long-term strategic concept. And now, if you look at what Japan is doing, look at the Philippines doing, everybody's arming up. If our defense commitment to those allies remain firm and unambiguous, I think that degree of worry would reduce. And for long term, and that's much better for the regional stability and for the U.S. as well. So your case will not go to fight
let me respond. Couple points. First of all, you know trade better than I do, but my understanding is that China's political economic picture is definitely not one that we're content with. I mean, there's large-scale intellectual property theft going on with China, and WTO membership hasn't solved it. Now, WTO membership may have been the right step, writ large. It seems to me it probably was, and I think you're right that a lot of the inducements that we have are better than the alternative. But the economic and trade picture is a big problem. Second of all, it's a commonplace in the political science literature and elsewhere that that the economic sphere is different than the security sphere. Countries just conceptually and also historically are much more willing to submit themselves to international adjudication in the trade and economic field. And I think that that's very much the case here. To that point, I think Chris's point is absolutely right. Chinese are sensitive to international perceptions, but they're a lot less sensitive than they are sensitive to direct force. And again, I think this is a question of proportion. I'm not, as I made clear, I'm not in favor of a hyperactive policy, but I think the danger now is that they see us as insufficiently resolute and the directions going in their way. So I think Chris's point is that we should play out the Filipino dispute, although that's absolutely a relatively narrow thing. But bear in mind that Chinese have defined the South China Sea as a core national interest, along with Taiwan and Tibet and other places.
And of course, don't recognize the jurisdiction.
Yeah, and don't recognize the jurisdiction. So jaw. So I think we need to be firm, but we need to play out. I think on Miles' point, I differ a bit. I think the trend lines are not should not give us such confidence as he seems to have about the military balance in the region, which is getting considerably more dangerous. I think we have the advantage now, but I worry about what the Chinese are going to be like in 10, 15 years when a lot of these capabilities that we've now seen in the parade the other day, for instance, become much more mature. They've moved on to different systems and they have the military advantage. So I think our objective should not be to make our allies like Japan do less. Actually, part of the reason that we should be resolute and firm now is to make sure that they do more so that we can balance China's rise. Because I think the alternative, actually, if China gets the upper hand, is they may not spend on, one possibility is they go get nuclear weapons. It's unlikely for a number of reasons, unless things get really bad. But the other possibility is that they end up just acceding to Chinese hegemony in the region, which is presumably not what we want, and then they don't spend. So the reality is that what we're likely to face is a tough competition, and we gotta get in that, but we're not going to return to the world of the 1990s.
Yeah. There's one more point here. China, more than any country in the world, China border 14 countries, more than any country in the world. Every one of the countries at some point, with the possible exception of Pakistan, has border disputes with China. I say possible because China occupies about 1/8 of Kashmir. So if Pakistan claims Kashmir, and then there's a border dispute. China has 6 maritime nations. China has maritime dispute with every one of them. So you're thinking about this. This is a very dangerous world, and there is that's hot spot. So we can resort to international organizations such as UN to have the dispute over there. But China does not want to resort to international dispute. Arbitrary. There's absolutely no chance for them to do it. So the only country that can make a difference, in my view, is U.S. and its allies in Asia. So we have to act responsibly, but with a very grim understanding of inaction. Yeah.
Mike has appropriately chided me that I need to let other people ask questions. Quick footnote.
There are 6 minutes to go, and 7 hands are up.
I'm glad you mentioned trade because
I advise you of that, including your former colleague at Hudson, Charles Horner, who also wrote a book on China, also paid for by Andy Marshall.
Right. He's
been waving his microphone in the air for 9 minutes now. So he and I are both former Senate staffers, and we suspect some kind of filibuster is going on.
Well, now it's 8 minutes, so let me try to get in just a couple of seconds before we turn to that. I'm glad you mentioned trade because that highlights another challenge of our strategy making with respect to China. It's commonly said in the Chinese press, the Americans just want to have another enemy like the Soviet Union. The problem with our China strategy right now is precisely that is not the situation we face. With the Soviets, we faced a fairly unambiguous competitive and almost purely competitive situation. The challenge of dealing with China from a competitive strategy perspective right now is that it is not entirely competitive, not entirely adversarial. If it were, frankly, it would be a lot simpler as an intellectual matter. The challenge is that there are both cooperative elements and competitive elements in the relationship. We've never actually had to do that kind of a thing before as strategy makers on any kind of a scale. That is the game that we are trying to learn by making it up as we go along. It's hard. I want to emphasize the competitive stuff because I think we've been falling down in that respect much more than we've been falling down on the cooperative side and the economic and trade worlds to some extent. But they're both important. So sorry. Anyway, my apologies for.
And if we buy your book, this will be covered in the last chapter, as a matter of fact.
Some of it, yes.
Okay, Mr. Horner, Dr. Horner.
I'm Charles Horner, also of Hudson Institute. I do have a question for Chris Ford that was inspired actually by something I heard from the panel, and I'll mention that in a moment. 3 quick points. Full disclosure requires me to report that I, along with Miles Yu, is one of the people asked by the University of Kentucky Press to review this book. So the right wing, and which I heartily recommended its publication, the right-wing conspiracy may not necessarily be vast, but it is well placed sometimes. Second point I'd like to stress is something that Chris said about his own book, first book, The Mind of Empire, which I think establishes a wonderful template for the current book. It is a long discussion of the Chinese sense of the world, how the world works, what the world order is, and so on, of which this second volume is in some respect in elaboration. Third, very briefly about the utility of a panel of this sort, a report from the field. There is in Los Angeles an organization called the Pacific Council on International Relations, which is a kind of council on foreign relations of the West Coast. And a while ago, they invited me to participate in its annual conference. And this very morning, in response to constant prodding from me, they said, in response to my inquiry, well, what do you want me to do? And they said, we want you to be on a panel, and there'll be some people on this panel. We want you to take somewhere between 5 and 7 minutes to describe what you think the United States grand strategy toward China ought to be. And so now I have all this stuff to boil down to approximately 6 minutes, and I'm sure something will come of it, but it speaks very nicely to Miles' point about the need of 3 days of expertise. We could describe all that needs to be done in 6 minutes.
Should we collect the rest of the comments and then we can cherry pick stuff at the very end? Is that a useful?
Sure.
My question is to Chris. It's inspired by what Mike said about the fact that we could be too tough, too discourteous, too provocative, and thereby provoke the Chinese into behavior we would not like. Is there anyone in China that you could identify as participating in a comparable discussion, which would go something like, these Americans, if we're too discourteous, too provocative, too assertive, we just might provoke them into producing weapons we would not like to see, into behavior we would not like to confront. Is this part of the debate in China, do you think? And if not, why not? That is to say, they seem to be insufficiently, from all I know, they seem to be insufficiently afraid of our irrationality, of our ability to be provoked, of our ability to have slights, endure slights to our national reputation, our amour-propre, and so on. And I'm curious to know whether there are such people in China who caution them about the propensity of Americans to take out their "Don't Tread on Me" flag from time to time and disrupt the international system.
We collect some and
Up to you, if you want to answer, Charles.
Since there are a lot of people out there, why don't if those of you who remain, maybe we can
3 minutes to go.
Collect a couple of additional questions and then we can just sort of toss in really quick stuff. There's down here. I don't know. I defer to the moderator.
Hands up.
We have one down here in front.
Right here, 2 in the front row.
And I know we've been bad about this, but in terms of keeping our own comments brief, but we would encourage you to try to keep the questions brief.
Okay, so I'm with the China Daily, and my question is, how do you make sure your research for the book reflect the true color of China? How do you make sure they're authentic enough? And also, what do you think about the incoming Chinese President Xi's visit to the U.S.? What do you think will make a difference to the future of U.S.-China relations? Thanks.
Stephen Piper, Independent. Was the September 3 transit of the bearing of the U.S. territorial waters a naval adjunct of the military demonstration display in Beijing? And secondly, should we take some sides on sovereignty regarding disputed territories?
And one more hand, maybe someone gave up and left, I'm afraid. Back in the back, there was one more question. Okay, so those two.
Let me see, real quickly. Individual Chinese, Charles. At the top of my head, I don't have names on the tip of my tongue. However, in the book, there are a number of references to people in, sort of America, the occasional America watcher. Now, they're not very common, but the occasional America watcher with whom I spoke or whose article I happened to come across, who was taking a somewhat more cautious, like, gosh, we need to make sure we don't get going too fast yet kind of perspective. I did have some people affiliated with military think tanks, for example, in person, tell me at the time, and I think my first interviews there were in 2011, that they were concerned that some of the early, that was in the period of, I think that was sort of the Scarborough Shoal standoff in the South China Sea and that kind of thing, that they were concerned that, well, they didn't put it in these terms, but the idea was that China might be sort of stopping biding its time a little too early. They didn't suggest that this was a misbegotten project in the first place, but they thought that the timing might be wrong and that it might be still too early to provoke the other countries of the region to coalesce against China. They were worried about that, and one of them said something to the effect of how, I'm concerned that we might be, might be overreaching a little bit. But so there seem to be some voices to that effect, although, not nearly as many as you might think under the circumstances. In response to the question from our colleague from China Daily here, how confident am I in the research? I actually spend the first couple of chapters focusing on the problem of what I call Chinese epistemology. How is it that we think we know what we think we know in doing research on China? And I'm acutely aware of the problem of trying to reach conclusions about what people really think in an information space that is so carefully bounded and controlled. It's not easy to control for the modern party state, but it is certainly not free in the sense that we're accustomed to speaking and writing and having discussions here. And I try to address those issues by facing them head on at the beginning of the book. And one of the answers I have to it is that I don't have deep confidence that I know what people really think. In that system, it is very hard to know anything about what people really think unless one has perhaps a very close friend with whom one has a drink quietly on the side in some unaccountable context. But what I've tried to do is look at the official propaganda narrative and try to use it as a way to illuminate what the regime's priorities are and how those priorities relate to politics and how the story of America as interpreted to Chinese has changed in connection with ongoing debates and struggles and challenges in China itself. That is something on which there is knowledge in the sense that whatever they really think, it is clearly a part of the regime's legitimacy discourse that certain things be said, certain things be not said or suppressed, certain positions be taken and that kind of thing. What I try to do is learn from the development of the overt narrative and use that as a window into what Chinese politics seem to be going on through that prism. But the problem of epistemology is very real and challenging in anybody doing research in China. And I would hope that other China scholars would, well, I don't think all China scholars writing on these issues today are sufficiently cautious in this respect. It is too common for think tank counterparts to be taken as if they were just think tank counterparts, as opposed to government salaried people who are subject to propaganda vetting and guidance just the same way as anybody else is in China, and whose career has involved them rising through ladders of seniority, at each of which points they have to survive a organization department approval chop for reliability and trustworthiness. I think we take those things for granted in dealing with our supposed counterparts. That goes for academics as well as think tankers. I think we are too credulous on certain political topics when it comes to public opinion surveys and looking at media in China, insofar as, although it is much more difficult to control the Chinese media space than it used to be, and the government has largely given up in certain respects. A lot of sort of cultural and entertainment type issues are more or less fair game for anyone these days. It's a much freer aggregate space than it used to be. But on particular issues of sensitivity, and the American narrative is one of those issues of the greatest sensitivity in these kinds of big picture political and geopolitical stuff. Those are issues that are just as controlled, or the regime spends at least as much time as ever trying to control those things. And they remain controlled enough that I think getting down through to what people really think in their heart of hearts is very challenging. But you can still learn a lot from looking at it. Sorry. John?
I'd like to answer your question about whether U.S. should take side in sovereignty issue. Sovereignty issue is very complicated. As I said, China has multiple border disputes with the people, virtually everybody on the border. I don't think it's a clear-cut yes or no. On some issues that involve international law, U.S. interest and alliance, U.S. should take an issue. For example, the Senkakus and the South China Sea. Because U.S. Some of the border issues were directly involved by with Americans. Senkaku was occupied by the U.S. Navy since the end of World War II. It was not returned to the Japanese until 1971 or 72. And the U.S. even paid rent. U.S. Navy used those islands as bombing targets. So U.S. paid rent, annual rent, to the Japanese owners on one of the islands. So there's no question about this. U.S. should take a side. When we say we don't take side, and then we also say when Senkaku was attacked, the U.S. will be fighting with the Japanese. So for the Chinese, that's hypocrisy. So that's one of the reasons why we should be clarified. We're going to take that. I'm glad some administration officials did take that last time. On South China Sea, yes, we should, because this is international law and everybody abide by it. On some other issues like India, China, and North Korea and Chinese border dispute on the Bakdu Mountains, obviously we shouldn't get involved. Let them fight. So that's basically is my answer. The question that this gentlelady from China Daily is very important about how do you know what China actually thinks. Chris answered the question. I'll give you one example. Chinese had an official biographer of Mao Zedong and Zhou Enlai. He was a really high-ranked official. His name is Gao Wenqian. Gao Wenqian wrote an official biography of Mao and Zhou, and he had access to all those archives. But he had to follow the party line to write his biography. After all the books are published, he feel like, I can't really tell what I really think about this gentleman. After I read all the stuff, guess what he did? He wanted to write a book. He fled to New York City. He stayed over there and he wrote a book about the Mao-Zhou relationship in the last 20 years or so. Fabulous. It's a great book. It's one of the best-selling books in China. I would say outside of China, but everybody come out of China would buy a book from New York or from Hong Kong, snuggle it back. So what I'm saying is it's very complicated. There's a lot of people in China who are very conscious. They want to write them, but they cannot really. It's not whether you can publish it or not. You can publish it, but there's a consequence of publishing what you really think. That really matters.
I guess just very briefly, I'd say to the first question, the Chinese are sufficiently afraid of our power, in my observation and what I can tell, that a policy of additional pressure would actually make sense. I think Chris has touched on the right point, which is that right now it's mostly a question of resolve. In the future, it will also be a question of capability, but today it's mostly a question of resolve. Will the Xi visit matter? It seems unlikely to me. I don't think we should be trying to do Xi Jinping any favors. I don't think we should be looking to embarrass him. But I don't see a tectonic change in the relationship. On the Bering Straits, I mean, who knows? But it seems unlikely that the Chinese would do something like that without thinking about it. On the other hand, it would kind of invite a compensatory response on our part. So maybe, who knows? It's like the stealth fighter. I mean, it seems like they probably knew, but it's hard to get inside. On the sovereignty issue, I guess I think for us the point is that the interests of our allies in particular should be respected, their territorial integrity respected, but we don't need to take particular positions on sovereignty issues. I mean, the Senkakus we judge to be administered by Japan; they're covered by the treaty, but as long as issues are peacefully adjudicated through internationally accepted means, I think that's I don't think we should be disinclined to get into particulars as long as our allies' kind of interests are being respected.
And are you willing to sign books? We promised you would.
I'd be delighted to.
Thank you all very much for coming.
Starting good.